This module is intended to assist Kentucky employers involved in the trucking industry in understanding their role in managing workers' compensation. Although the information contained in this module addresses topics related to workers' compensation, this module does not address an employer's legal obligations relative to workers' compensation. This module is intended for Kentucky employers that operate one or more commercial motor vehicles and hence are subject to the annual Education and Safety Training Regulation passed into law in 2013. This module is designed to provide trucking companies and other businesses that use commercial motor vehicles within the Commonwealth of Kentucky with knowledge to effectively manage workers' compensation within their company in an effort to minimize the frequency and control the cost of workers' compensation claims. This training module was created for you by Midwestern Insurance Alliance, the workers' compensation carrier endorsed by the Kentucky Motor Transport Association and the host of the website truckingworkerscomp.com. At the conclusion of this module is a brief quiz. In some of the other modules, we addressed how the workers' compensation system works in Kentucky. Specifically, we discussed that it is mandatory for most companies, even if they only have one employee, that it is a no-fault insurance system, and that it's considered to be the exclusive remedy for work-related injuries. We discussed what workers' compensation benefits are paid in Kentucky, how workers' compensation premiums are calculated, and the experience rating process. In this module, we're going to discuss what you, the employer, manager, or supervisor, can do to manage workers' compensation within your company. In the module entitled Understanding Workers' Compensation Premiums, we addressed the topic of experience rating in some detail, but it all boils down to this. Workers' compensation is a loss-sensitive insurance plan. By that, I mean that the final cost of your workers' compensation premium is at least partially determined by the losses that your company incurred. For that reason, it's imperative that someone at your company assumes the responsibility for managing your workers' compensation costs. Most trucking companies go to great lengths to manage their fuel and tire costs. That's because those are unavoidable operational costs of running a trucking company, and to the extent that those costs can be minimized, it will add dollars to the bottom line. The same is true with workers' compensation. It is an unavoidable operational cost of running a trucking company, and to the extent that insurance premiums can be minimized, it adds dollars to the company's bottom line. To be effective managing workers' compensation within your company, you first need to define the objective. As mentioned at the beginning of this module, workers' compensation insurance premiums are determined, at least in part, by what your insurance company has paid out in claims. So your objective is fairly easy to define. Minimize what the insurance company pays out in claims. If you're successful in that one objective, you will minimize your future workers' compensation premiums and add to the company's bottom line. To effectively manage workers' compensation within a trucking company, or really any industry, will require you to do 6 things and do them well. The first is to make injury prevention a priority. Another is to report claims promptly. Another is to investigate claims thoroughly. Another thing you must do is to deter workers' compensation fraud. Closely related to that is that you must detect fraud. Another thing that you must do is to keep communication lines open. And lastly, you must implement a return-to-work program. The first step to effectively managing workers' compensation within a trucking company is to make injury prevention a priority. Notice that I did not say make safety a priority. I said make injury prevention a priority. Certainly, Midwestern Insurance Alliance advocates making safety a priority within any industry, including trucking. However, when it comes to the trucking industry, many people have a narrow definition of safety. Ask a trucking company employer or safety director what their company does to make safety a priority, and they'll likely rattle off a litany of DOT mandates that they comply with, including drug testing, vehicle inspections, physical exams, hours of service logs, driver's files, and more. They may even tell you about training that their company does that's not required by DOT to address topics such as defensive driving, winter weather driving, or road rage. Although each of those things is important to promoting safety, they have one thing in common. They address safety on the road exclusively. They are intended to address the very real hazards of motor vehicle accidents involving commercial motor vehicles. But that's it. However, only 15 to 25% of the injuries to commercial drivers result from motor vehicle accidents. Companies who do not aggressively address injury causes associated with the remaining 75 to 85% of the truck driver injuries cannot legitimately say that they make injury prevention a priority. Although not all trucking companies will have the same injury exposures, a good place to start is to assess how well your company does at addressing the most common sources of injury to commercial drivers throughout the trucking industry. Motor vehicle accidents top the list. Even though they only account for 15 to 25% of driver injuries in the trucking industry, it is the most significant injury exposure for any commercial driver. In fact, for a company to legitimately claim that they make injury prevention a priority, they must go well beyond DOT compliance to address the prevention of motor vehicle accidents. Handling freight can be another source of injury within the trucking industry. Whether the drivers have routine involvement in unloading freight, assisting with unloading freight, or only have to handle freight to repalletize an occasional pallet of freight that fell in transit, controls should be in place to minimize the chances of injury. And for companies that have a strict driver no-touch policy, training and documentation should reinforce that no-touch policy to discourage drivers from assisting shippers or receivers to speed up the process. Handling tarps is an exposure that is typically limited to drivers pulling flatbeds or other open-air trailers, but it is a very significant hazard. Any company whose drivers handle tarps should make addressing this one hazard a primary injury prevention focus. Falls while entering or exiting a truck cab or trailer is another one of those topics that, like motor vehicle accidents, affect every trucking company. In fact, more drivers are injured from falls getting in and out of a truck cab than any other non-driving task. Securing and unsecuring freight is something to which many drivers have at least some exposure. Whether a driver pulls a flatbed trailer and has to secure every load with straps or chains, or he pulls a dry van or reefer trailer and must place and remove load bars, there is a potential for injury associated with those tasks which needs to be addressed through both policy and training. Truck repair and maintenance presents significant injury potential and is something that needs to be addressed even if your company does not have mechanics on staff. Drivers need to know what maintenance tasks they are permitted to perform on their own and which ones they need to leave to the professionals. For the tasks that drivers are permitted to perform, even if they are simple things such as replacing windshield wipers or adding engine coolant, injury prevention should be considered and addressed. Opening and closing a trailer door is something that can present a significant source of injury for drivers. Whether that injury potential is from falling freight when the door is opened, or from the wind catching an open trailer door and ripping it out of the driver's hands. For drivers who pull dry van and reefer trailers, this injury prevention topic is a must. Sliding trailer tandem axles can be a source of injury in a number of different ways. If your drivers have to slide trailer tandem axles, this topic is another must. Drivers not only need to know how to perform this task without getting injured, but the company must also have a process for keeping the release and slide mechanism in good working order. Because of the awkward posture and force required, pulling the fifth wheel release to uncouple a trailer can be another source of injury that needs to be addressed in almost every trucking company's injury prevention policies and training. And let's not forget about the hazards associated with cranking trailer landing gear. Most drivers will be faced with coupling to loaded trailers that have been dropped far too low to allow the driver to back under it, and with inconsiderate yard jockeys who park trailers so close together that they need to be a contortionist just to get to the dolly crank handle. However, injuries associated with cranking trailer landing gear are sometimes brought on by the drivers themselves, such as a driver who strikes himself in the face with a crank handle while trying to spin it with one finger. After considering this list, you've probably noticed that most of these hazards are present in your own operation, at least to some degree. Certainly, that list did not address all of the hazards to which your employees may be exposed. After considering these hazards, think about the things that make your company unique. What potential for injury accompany those unique characteristics? Also, what employees do you have in addition to drivers, and what are the injury hazards that they face? If you plan to make injury prevention a priority, you've got to start with understanding the various ways in which your employees may be injured on the job, and then commit to addressing them aggressively. To the extent that you're able to prevent employee injuries, none of the remaining keys to managing workers' compensation is relevant. If an injury never happens, there's nothing to report to the insurance company, nothing to investigate, no need to create a modified duty task or anything else. However, even in companies who make injury prevention a priority, injuries still happen, at least occasionally. For that reason, we need to consider what can be done to manage workers' compensation after an injury occurs. The very first thing that must be done to get a workers' compensation claim off on the right foot is to ensure that the claim is submitted to the insurance company promptly. Kentucky workers' compensation statutes indicate that the employer must submit a completed first report of injury form within 3 days of being notified of an injury. However, in reality, the quicker you get the completed first report of injury form into the insurance carrier, the better. Early reporting of injuries has been shown to reduce claims costs by 11% by reducing the number of claims that result in lost time and by ensuring that your employees receive the best medical treatment as quickly as possible. After promptly reporting injuries to the insurance carrier, the next key to managing workers' compensation is to investigate the incident thoroughly. It's unfortunate but true. Many safety directors of trucking companies fail miserably at investigating and analyzing non-driving injuries. Far too many of these safety directors simply gather enough facts about an injury to complete the first report of injury form. Although forms are necessary for initiating a workers' compensation claim, filling out the forms should be viewed as the beginning of the process, not the end. So why do so many safety directors miss the boat? Why are more of them not taking the time and effort to dig deep into every single injury reported to them? Perhaps too many other responsibilities, such as DOT compliance, interviewing new drivers, or conducting training, keeps these safety directors from doing more. Maybe these safety directors are simply of the mindset that some injuries are inevitable, unavoidable, or acceptable. Maybe they have a preconceived notion that there's nothing that can be done to prevent an injury that appears, at least on the surface, to be the result of pure carelessness. Or maybe they have seen so many similar incidents in the past that they feel, without digging deep that they know exactly what happened and why it happened. The lack of intense effort aimed at understanding the specific and unique aspects of each injury can single-handedly cause a trucking company's workers' compensation claims to spiral out of control. History repeats itself. That statement is particularly true with respect to employee injuries. Work-related injuries with very similar causes will continue to occur over and over throughout the years unless something is done to intervene. Although the fact that almost all driver injuries occur while the driver is away from the company facility certainly creates a challenge, that doesn't mean that an effective accident investigation is impossible. Regardless of where the injury occurred, the fundamental principle of accident investigation is not merely to understand what happened, it's to identify the root cause. Even when the injury happened somewhere else, you may be able to get the injured employee to demonstrate what happened, if it can be done safely, and ask a logical series of why questions to dig down to the root cause. The next key to managing workers' compensation is to deter workers' compensation fraud. Although a majority of people have a strong enough moral fiber not to be swayed into committing workers' compensation fraud, the odds are good that, under the right circumstances, one or more of your current employees could be swayed. For this reason, every company, regardless of industry, should have an aggressive campaign of its own to counter the external influences. However, several characteristics of trucking companies, such as high turnover, lack of supervision, and minimal direct contact with management, amplify the need for this effort within trucking companies. One of the most fundamental aspects of your effort to deter fraud should be to educate drivers about the costs associated with workers' compensation fraud. Let them know how fraud influences your workers' compensation premiums, and in turn, how insurance costs influence wages and fleet enhancements. Also, educate drivers about the consequences of committing workers' compensation fraud and the company's commitment to pursue violators. As another element of the education process, it's a good practice to provide all new hires with a written statement of your company's workers' compensation policies. These policies should include procedures for timely reporting of injuries, the names of healthcare providers your drivers should use, and a brief explanation of what they can expect from you and your workers' compensation insurance carrier in the event of an injury. The intent of providing this information is to alleviate uncertainty and to provide assurance to the driver that he will be treated fairly. The message your employees should walk away with is simple. They don't need to resort to fraud to be treated right. Your efforts to deter workers' compensation fraud shouldn't end with educating your drivers. You should additionally engage in activity that fosters open communication and mutual respect. Although it may not seem like productive work at the time, taking the time to get to know your drivers and to develop a rapport can pay off big. Far too often, drivers complain about being treated as a number, and at that point, they are far more likely to engage in acts against their employer, such as workers' compensation fraud. Make sure that they know that you won't ignore their complaints and concerns about their job. As a safety director, you should always be aware that the strongest predictor of workers' compensation fraud is a chronically disgruntled workforce. Although it's important to deter workers' compensation fraud, it is at least equally important to detect workers' compensation fraud when it's being perpetrated within your company. There's a number of things that can alert you to the possibility that an employee may be attempting to commit workers' compensation fraud. These are commonly referred to as red flags. One of these red flags is that the alleged injury occurs the first thing after an employee returns to work after a few days off. This is a red flag because the employee could have been injured while off work and is trying to pass off the injury as something that is work-related just to have it covered by workers' compensation. Also related to injury reporting is late reporting. If an employee delays reporting an injury without a reasonable explanation, that's a red flag. Although there are plenty of occasions, particularly for over-the-road truck drivers, when they could be legitimately injured and there are no witnesses to see the incident, it should be considered a red flag when there is no witness and at the same time the incident description doesn't logically support the cause of the injury. Another red flag is when the reported accident occurs immediately before or after a strike, job termination, layoff, end of a big project, or the conclusion of seasonal work. Along the same line, it's a red flag whenever the employee's description of the accident conflicts with the medical history or injury report, or when the employee's version of the events change over time. Additionally, if an employee has reported a number of suspicious or litigated claims, it's a red flag. Relative to treatment, it can be a red flag for fraud if the employee refuses a diagnostic procedure to confirm the nature or extent of his injury. As mentioned in a different module, Kentucky statutes allow employees to select their own physician for the treatment of work-related injuries. However, it's well known that some doctors have a reputation for being less reputable. When these doctors are used, it's a red flag. Another red flag is if the employee claims to be disabled but is hard to reach at home following the injury. Red flags can also be raised by an employee's attitude. A disgruntled or uncooperative attitude may appear either before or after an employee reports an injury. Regardless of when this attitude becomes evident, it should be considered to be a possible indicator of fraud. Generally, the more red flags, the more questionable the claim is. So when a claim is characterized by several red flags that seem to point to the possibility that a claim is fraudulent, you need to take action. This generally involves reporting your concerns to your workers' compensation insurance carrier. However, understand that not all questionable claims warrant the insurance company dispatching a private investigator to catch the employee on videotape. Much of the investigative work done by insurance companies is done through closely reviewing the employee's prior medical history and other less spectacular means. In addition to reporting your suspicions to your insurance company, Kentucky has a workers' compensation fraud hotline that you can call. The number for that hotline is 1-800-554-8601. If you suspect fraud, it's not time to wash your hands of the situation and turn it over to your insurance company. Instead, it's time to ensure that you're doing everything in your power to discourage the employee from going any further down the road of workers' compensation fraud. As we'll discuss next, this can be done through maintaining close contact with the employee and doing your best to prevent the relationship from becoming strained. One of the most often overlooked keys to managing workers' compensation within any company is keeping the lines of communication open. Workers' compensation should not be a mystery to your employees. When they're first hired, educate them about what they should legitimately know. They may have misconceptions about workers' compensation based upon experiences with their prior employer, friends, family members, or even attorney commercials. And if you can set the facts straight before it becomes an issue, you're more likely to be effective at managing the claims. Let them know what type of injuries are covered, what type of benefits are paid, how benefits are received, and when wage replacement benefits kick in. Let them know about your modified duty program. Explain to them the impact of fraud and abuse. And let them know who they can contact if they have any questions. Although there should be communication with employees about workers' compensation as a part of new hire orientation, effective communication is absolutely critical following an injury. The employer should remain in contact with the employee throughout the recovery process. The best way to do this is through a weekly scheduled phone call or having the employee call in after each medical visit. However, If the injured worker is able to come into the company facility for these weekly contacts, that's even better, as it enables the employee to continue to feel connected to the workplace. Although routine communication with the injured employee is important, so is the quality of that communication. Treat the injured employee with empathy, concern, and compassion. Don't be focused on assigning blame or trying to abdicate liability for the incident. Instead, focus on ensuring that the injured employee receives the best care possible and that you are genuinely concerned about his or her well-being. Employers who display honest concern and empathy are likely to foster a bond between the injured employee and the company. Other drivers will see this and will believe that management truly cares about them as well. Conversely, the employer who responds with doubt, accusations, or who fails to consider possible management deficiencies which may have contributed to the incident will likely foster an adversarial relationship with the injured driver and over time will chip away at the overall morale of the workforce. Lastly, and certainly not least in your effort to manage workers' compensation within your company, is to have a strong return-to-work program. In fact, if we were to rank the 6 keys of managing workers' compensation that are presented in this module based upon their impact, having a return-to-work program would be second only to making injury prevention a priority. There's nothing new about the concept of return-to-work programs. However, you might know it by a different name. Some people call it light duty, others call it modified duty. Still others might call it restricted duty or transitional duty. Regardless of what you call it, if you want to control your workers' compensation costs, having a return-to-work program is absolutely essential. In general terms, a return-to-work program is nothing more than the process by which you, with the consent of the employee's doctor, allow an employee to come back to work after a work-related injury while they recover, even though they can't perform their regular job duties during that recovery period. It's been a successful management tool since the very earliest days of workers' compensation insurance, even among trucking companies. However, because the very nature of the trucking industry makes return-to-work programs challenging, many trucking companies claim that it's just not feasible for them. Such attitudes can cost those companies dearly. One way it can cost is in insurance premiums. As mentioned earlier, workers' compensation is a loss-sensitive insurance plan. Companies who have a return-to-work program dramatically reduce their overall workers' compensation costs, and that can have a tremendous impact on future premiums. In addition to helping to keep workers' compensation premiums in check, having a return-to-work program sends a clear message to all drivers that claiming a work-related injury is not an alternative method of getting paid vacation time. Instead, the message that is sent is that time off work is the exception rather than the rule when it comes to work-related injuries. In fact, a consistently applied return-to-work program is such a deterrent to fraud and abuse that it not only helps weed out individuals looking for a free ride, but it may also keep that type of driver from applying for a job in the first place. Additionally, having a return-to-work program permits employees who have been injured at work to contribute to the bottom line, even if they temporarily can't perform all of their normal job duties. By creating a temporary work assignment for an injured employee, you're ensuring that the company will gain some level of productivity from him. On the other hand, simply stating that it's not feasible for your company to use return to work ensures that your company will receive 0% productivity from the injured employee until the doctor releases him to return to work without physical restrictions. Although it's unquestionable that return to work programs benefit employers, it provides benefit to employees as well. Following an injury, particularly a workers' compensation claim, a driver may question if his employment is secure and may have very real and immediate financial concerns. Having a return-to-work program helps ease those fears by showing the injured employee that he's of value to the company even when he's not able to function at 100%. In this module, we discuss 6 keys to managing workers' compensation within your company. These include making injury prevention a priority, reporting claims promptly, investigating claims thoroughly, detecting and deterring workers' compensation fraud, maintaining good communication with employees before and after injuries are reported, and having a return-to-work program. If you'd like additional information on any of these topics, we encourage you to visit truckingworkerscomp.com, a website maintained by Midwestern Insurance Alliance, the only workers' compensation provider endorsed by the Kentucky Motor Transport Association.